welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. In this episode of 30 Minutes, we're going highbrow to examine the lives and idiosyncrasies of some of the great classical composers of all time. I have to admit I had to do some homework for this episode and was fascinated to learn that some of the greatest names in classical music led scandalous lives and in one case died accidentally by his own hand. Fortunately, today's guest is well versed in the lives of the men who wrote, played, and conducted some of the greatest music ever composed. David Gitlin is a well-known corporate attorney with the firm of Royer, Cooper, Cohen, and Braunfeld, who has many avocational interests, among them researching the lives and works of well-known and lesser-known composers. David, welcome to 30 Minutes.
Thank you, Rick.
Sorry,
Pleasure
I
to be here.
fumbled over the name of your firm.
That's okay.
Braunfeld?
Yes. Yeah, most people refer to us as RCCB.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I was really looking forward to this one because, as I said, I really had to do my research.
I'm sorry I gave you homework.
No. I mean, I like big bands. I like Sinatra. I like, the 40s and 50s. I'm an old guy. Mm-hmm. But this really was fascinating, learning about these great men whose names I've known all my life.
Right.
But nothing about their lives, the trials and tribulations, the connection between their sadness in some cases. Right. And the genius of their compositions. Right. I'm sure there was some connection.
And really you appreciate their music more if you know more about them and their circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. And the times that they lived in. Mm-hmm. I'm told there is some connection between mathematicians and engineers and music. What's the connection between the law and classical music?
There's no discernible connection that I can think of. Other than the fact that being a broad-minded, intellectually curious person cannot hurt in terms of being a good lawyer.
Yeah, but what was your introduction to classical music? Do you play an instrument?
So I sadly no. I took lessons, but I was born with two left hands. So my dad is a very talented individual. He plays the piano very nicely. He draws. He paints beautifully.
And you got none
I got the ability to appreciate it, but not the ability to do it. And so he once told me there are two kinds of people in the world: those who do and those who critic. Mm-hmm. Right. So I fall squarely in the critic side of things.
But did those talents skip a generation? Do your children have any of those talents?
Yes. So my daughter actually is a Broadway, was a Broadway actor. And,
really?
And yes, and she's now in production.
Really?
Production. So I guess yes, she inherited something.
Yeah. You took your interest in classical music to up a notch when you started a podcast, with another attorney in Zurich. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so that's really a very satisfying story. I met Andreas working on an M&A deal. He was a part-time in-house lawyer at one of my clients in Switzerland. And we were working on this deal together, and all on Zoom. It was during the pandemic. I never met him in person. I never met him before either. And after the deal closed, he sent me a very nice email saying, he enjoyed working with me, and he was very Swiss. He took the liberty of looking at my bio, and he saw I was a classical music lover. And so he wanted to tell me that his other job is that of a composer, a conductor and a pianist. And he sent me a bunch of YouTube videos of his work, which I thought was really cool. And so we started corresponding about classical music. And this corresponding just kept flowing back and forth for several months. And then one time he called me and he said, "Listen, I'm enjoying our exchanges very much." I told him I was very flattered because, he was a professional. I was just a fan. And he says, "No, I have a proposition. Would you like to partner with me to do a series of video chats about classical music?" And I had no idea how to do it, but I said, sure. So I turned to a friend of mine who's a a film and TV director, and he said, "Oh, no problem. We'll coach you and we'll get you an editor." And we started coming up with topics and filming it, and the editor, put some graphics and videos and photos in this and created, a half an hour or so video cast. So we opened our own YouTube channel, and we now have 5 videos in there. And it's a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. B, it really created a very nice relationship between us. I mean, we've become good friends. We've since then visited him and his lovely family in Zurich, and we feel very close. And it just came out of nowhere, right? Came out of just an M&A deal. Mm-hmm. So I'm very pleased with that. And
But where did your interest in classical music come from?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, obviously I listened to it as a child at home. Then I started going to my grandmother's, symphony subscription, and I just started getting into it. And I'm a curious person. Yes. And wanted to learn more. And the more I learned, the more I enjoyed it, and the more I knew, and it's just mushroomed into, okay, well, let's...
A symphony or in Philadelphia or New York?
Actually, it was in Tel Aviv.
Ah.
Yeah, the Israel Philharmonic.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Were you in the Army as well?
Well, that's
a long story. We're all going to that. Okay. David, when I was doing the research, as I said, I was absolutely fascinated to learn some of the details, at least on the internet, for whatever that's worth. Mm-hmm. Some of the lives that these great composers led, scandalous to say the least.
Some of them, yeah.
But not all, but some of the big ones, some of the really big ones that I would never have suspected. And I started wondering whether the correlation between the sadness that some of them had in their lives and the genius is there, in your research and experience, what's the connection between that? Well,
I mean, from a saying, you can't be a great poet unless you're sad,
yeah.
Right? So there's something to it, right? I mean, music conveys emotion, and people convey their emotions into music. Mm-hmm. So, for sure, not everybody, had tragic, sad lives, but many did. Also, it was a time when, people got sick. Medical advances hadn't been made. Talking about promiscuous, right? Syphilis was prevalent. Mm-hmm. There are a number of composers who either had syphilis and suffered from it terribly, or died from it. Right. So you have circumstances where, people are struggling financially, are struggling with illness, mm-hmm. and they still have this genius, and they have this need to compose. Schubert is a great example, right? So Schubert is one of my favorite composers. First of all, he wrote some of the most absolutely stunningly gorgeous music. His lyricism is unparalleled, and he wrote, hundreds, close to 1,000, or even a little over 1,000 composition in his life. He died when he was 31 years old. I mean, think about the output in 31 years, and then take into account that the last 4 or 5 years, he was really ill. He had syphilis. He was very sick, and he was completely penniless. He didn't own a piano. Sometimes he didn't have a place to live. He crashed on people's friends' couches, and all with those horrible circumstances, he still managed to compose hundreds of absolutely stunning compositions, many of which were discovered only after his death. So you take his art and his output and his life, and you say, how is that even possible?
And the answer is?
Well, I mean, it's a level of genius that is
Yeah.
hard to describe.
Yeah.
Really.
In all that I read, there was no clue as to where these people got the inspiration for the beautiful music they wrote.
Right.
Not a love that they had or a relationship they had. Oh no, that's not true. There were a couple of instances where there were relationships that you
sure.
can infer inspired.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
Otherwise, what inspired them?
I mean, I think it's just innate genius. I mean, you can't write at that level and not be immensely talented. We mentioned Mozart in a prior conversation, right? Well, Mozart is probably considered the most kind of innate genius that ever lived, in the classical music world. I mean, by the time he was 8 years old, he already was composing symphonies. I mean, just think about it. These are people who are immensely and uniquely talented.
And the pictures of Mozart, he seems almost regal. And yet, from what I read, he lived in squalor. His reputation was he was a messy man.
Well, there are a lot of myths about Mozart. First and foremost, the one in the film Amadeus, which is a wonderful film and incredibly entertaining, but is based on a false premise that he was essentially killed indirectly by Salieri. There's no basis to that. It's just that is just a complete made-up story. But it's a wonderful story. But the movie does depict some of the characteristics of Mozart. He was a boy genius. He was appreciated, but he was never given this success in he was never regarded in his lifetime the way we regarded him. Mm-hmm. He always struggled financially. He didn't really have royal sponsors in the traditional way. And so yes, I don't think that necessarily he lived in squalor, but he was struggling financially throughout his life.
I read that he wrote the overture to Don Giovanni the morning of the premiere, and he was coming off of a really bad hangover. Right. Now, is that fiction?
Well, so that is,
or is that Mozart?
Okay, so the true story is that he didn't write it the morning of the performance. He wrote it the night before.
Oh, I see.
Right? By his own account, he said he wrote it the night before after going out with friends. There's no mentioning that he was stoned or anything like that. But he wrote it late at night. It took him 3 hours. Now, again, how is it possible? It's possible when you're talking about that level of genius.
Probably could have done it in 2 if he'd been sober.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, if you hear the overture, it's almost impossible to think of somebody creating it in 3 hours. But he was reputed that as a young child, he was able to listen to complicated pieces of music and recreate them from just one time listening to them. That is incredible.
Vivaldi,
yes,
I read, was a priest at age 15.
He was a priest.
I don't know whether or not he continued as a priest through adulthood.
No, he actually...
Was he a practicing priest?
He was. I mean, he was a practicing priest. He obviously wasn't his full-time occupation because he was a very prolific composer. In fact, so prolific, it's also hard to imagine. He wrote more than 500 concerti and music in other forms. I mean, that's an incredible output. I don't know when he had time to do his priestly duties. Yeah, but he did, and he died a priest. And his story is fascinating fascinating in that while he was very famous when he was alive, somehow when he died, he was forgotten. He was forgotten. He left hundreds of manuscripts of his work in the monastery where he lived, and then was forgotten for 250 years. It wasn't until the 20th century that they discovered this trove of manuscripts in this monastery, and they didn't know what to do with it, and so they wanted to sell it, right? And so they called the National Library in Turin, who assigned a musicologist to go and look at it, and he looked at it and he said, "Wow, this is unbelievable," and essentially revived Vivaldi after 200 plus years of complete silence. I mean, how crazy is that? If you think about the Four Seasons that he wrote, right? It is the single most recorded and played classical music piece ever. More than anything Mozart wrote, more than anything Beethoven wrote. This is the single most played music.
Is that right?
Yes. And it was forgotten for 200 plus years.
You told me that you're, the three composers that are of particular interest to you are Schubert, Verdi, and the third was Rachmaninoff.
Yes.
Why?
Well,
of all of them, why?
Yeah, so I particularly love their music. So that's, that's reason enough. There are, obviously, we spoke about Schubert, why Schubert is so close to my heart. And, just to think about the beauty of his music and the circumstances of his life, and it's hard to put the two of them together. There are some very touching stories about Vivaldi and about Rachmaninoff. I don't know if we have time to go into them, but, let's talk about Verdi, for example. So Verdi was a musician that came from the countryside. He tried to, he didn't have any connections. He tried to get into the Milan Conservatory. It was rejected. So he didn't have an easy beginning. And finally, somebody started to help him out and sponsor him, and he started getting some work. At the same time, he got married and had 2 children in subsequent years. Well, he was writing this opera called King for a Day. It was a comic opera. And while he was writing it, he suffered a horrible tragedy. Both his children and his wife died in the span of a year, 2 years, while he was writing this. And so you can imagine his state of mind. And the output was that the opera was a complete fiasco. It was terrible. And so he had his career being derailed, his family devastated. He was not in good shape. And he wanted to quit. And there were people who believed in him and kept asking him to try again and try again. And he kept rejecting until finally somebody dumped into his lap this score for an opera about the Israelites being captive in Babylon. The opera was called Nabucco, which is the kind of the Italian name of Nebuchadnezzar, which was the Babylonian king. And in it is a very beautiful choir piece where the Israelites, which are captive, are singing about their desire to become free. And it's a stunning piece of work, stunning. And he saw that and he said, I can't give that up. So he took this on. He actually got the story right. He wrote the choir. music for the story. And they staged it, and it became a huge hit, immediately a huge hit. And this choir piece called Va Pensiero became essentially the unofficial national anthem of Italy, because Italy was then ruled by the Austrians. Everybody associated the Israelites' desire to be free with their desire to be free of the Austrians. It is a very rousing, beautiful melody. Everybody was singing on the streets. Verdi became a sensation overnight. And later ended up becoming the greatest opera composer of all times. So here's a career that would have never happened but for this break that he had.
How did they earn their reputation? What I mean is, back then, opera houses were relatively small.
Yeah.
The wealthy were able to go and sit in the front seats. Otherwise, you were up on the nosebleed bleachers. But the point is, there weren't that many common folks who could hear an opera. Right? So how did word spread?
Well, that's a good question. So word of mouth, right? I mean, scores were, to the people who knew how to play, scores were sold so that people could play things at home. Va Pensiero is a great example. I mean, people were really humming it. It's like you come out of a great Broadway musical with a showpiece, right? And people hum it, and sing it, and it spread, and one taught the melody to the other, and then scores were circulated, and that's how things spread.
You said that the great stories you selected were Vivaldi, Paganini, Lully, and Granados?
Granados. Yes.
The Spaniard.
Yes.
I'd never heard of the second two, Lully and Granados.
Yeah, so we chose to showcase Lully and Granados in one of our episodes when we talked about interesting ways in which composers died. And those two have the best stories on how they died. I mean, it's a little macabre, but they're great stories. So Jean-Baptiste Lully, which is not widely played right now, but at the time, he was by far the most prominent Baroque composer in France. In fact, he was the court composer for Louis XIV, and was incredibly influential and powerful. He actually started. He wasn't even French. He was Italian. He was from Florence. His name was Giovanni Battista, and he was a pauper. He was a child who was basically performing in the streets. And a French nobleman saw this kid performing and took a liking to him and decided to take him to Paris and give him proper education. And so he took him to Paris, and turns out that Lully was a very gifted dancer. And so he started dancing in royal dance companies. And there he befriended this other dancer who was the future Louis XIV. And so they became friends. And when Louis XIV became the Sun King, he had Lully become the court composer. And Lully went from a pauper in Florence, dancing in the streets, to being this very, very prominent, powerful composer. And apparently not well liked by his peers or the people who worked for him. I mean, I think the success kind of got a little to his head. But at the time, there were no conductors the way there are conductors today. The concept of conducting with a baton didn't really start until much later. The way things were conducted at the time was usually the composer would keep the tempo by having kind of a heavy baton that he would strike on the wood floor to keep the tempo. And so you hear the composition, and you hear the baton, the big mast stricken and keeping the tempo. Well, in one occasion, Lee was doing just that, and I guess he got a little too excited, and he slams his mast into his foot. And at the time they wore this little kind of effeminated, little dainty, pointy thing, and he slams it, and apparently he did some damage and broke the skin, may have broken a couple of bones, but he refused treatment. He kept going, and he just didn't want to be treated. And he got infected, and it became to a point where he started developing gangrene. And the doctors told him that they have to amputate him, otherwise he would die. And he famously said, "I would rather die than not be able to dance," and refused to get amputated, and he died. Now, Granados is a tragic story. Really, I mean, it's just like bad luck after bad luck. So Enrique Granados was a prominent Spanish pianist and composer. He composed some very beautiful music and piano music, and he was invited to do a series of concerts in the United States, including a concert for President Wilson. So he was a well-known figure. So he comes over to the United States. He has a series of concerts. They're apparently very successful, and he's being asked to do just one more concert. And he somehow agreed to do one more concert, and as a result of that, he misses his boat back to Europe.
Yes.
And he has to take a different boat, but now he has to take a boat that takes him to England first, and then from England to Spain. So it's just like missing an airplane, right?
Yes.
So he and his wife take the boat to England, and it's fine. And then from England, they had to take the boat to Spain. And on the way, the Germans
the U-boat.
bombed the boat, right? Now, half the boat was destroyed, and the other half was not. His chamber was in the place that was not destroyed, but he happened to be on the other side, right? So anyway, so the boat is obviously damaged. They had to evacuate him. So when he asked to be, his turn to get evacuated with his wife, they wouldn't let him board the boats because his wife was too obese.
Yes.
And so basically he refuses to go alone, and they give him and his wife basically like either a little boat or a little plank or something that was clearly unsafe. And that's how they got evacuated because of her size. And of course that capsized. And then she sank. And then he dived to try to save. And he,
tragic.
And he,
yeah.
Right. So one bad luck after another. It was very, very tragic death. Ironically, his son, who was essentially named Enrique Granados Jr., was a champion swimmer.
But he wasn't there.
No, of course not.
Or he was the other boat.
He was he probably stayed in Spain. He would even go to the United States.
This is really fascinating, and I haven't covered most of the questions, all this research, and we're running out of time.
Yeah.
I'd love to have you come back.
Sure.
If you're interested, because there's so many other stories.
I'll dress up next time.
And the music, all of it is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And some of the big names, I'd like to know more about.
Sure.
Some of their life, their stories. So thank you very, very much for being here.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it. My guest today has been David Gitlin, who obviously is an expert in the classics and those who are responsible for it. Until next time, this is Rick Anthony. Take very good care of yourselves.